He married his bride's twin sister. When he discovered the truth, he was shocked. The wedding march began to play. The doors opened and James, standing at the altar, gazed down the central aisle as his heart raced. The smiling faces of the guests became a blur as his eyes searched the entrance, where Sophia was expected to appear at any moment. And there she was. Sophia, in her pure silk white dress, advanced down the aisle. Her walk was too calculated, her expression too tense. The way she held the bouquet in front of her body seemed meticulously rehearsed. When their eyes met, James felt a shiver run down his spine. There was something in Sophia's eyes, something different. Upon reaching the altar, her father handed Sophia's hand to James. When he touched the bride's skin, James noticed it was ice cold, trembling. "Are you okay?" whispered James. Sophia merely nodded, avoiding looking directly into his eyes. The minister began the ceremony, his voice echoing through the historic church. James tried to concentrate on the words, but his mind was in turmoil. In the first row, the Blackwood family watched with expressions that varied between tension and resignation. Eleanor Blackwood, the imposing matriarch, kept her chin up, but her restless eyes betrayed her apparent calm. Mr. Richard Blackwood, the family patriarch and owner of one of the country's largest construction companies, maintained a hard, almost impassive expression. And Nathan, Sophia's younger brother, couldn't stop fidgeting with his tie, as if it was suffocating him. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next exciting developments in this story of love, betrayal, and discovery. New stories every day to touch your heart. When it came time for the vows, Sophia hesitated. Her lips trembled, and for a moment James thought she might give up. But then, in a low, almost inaudible voice, she recited words that seemed strange, as if they weren't her own. "James," she began, her voice faltering, "before God and these witnesses, I promise—" Another pause, longer. "Promise to love you until—" Her eyes filled with tears. "Until life parts us." Something was deeply wrong. Sophia had written personalized vows weeks ago. She was reciting generic words, without the passion and personality that characterized everything she did. Before James could process what was happening, a thunderous sound echoed through the church. The main doors opened abruptly, and a figure appeared at the entrance, breathless. It was another bride. Wrinkled dress, disheveled hair, face red and marked by tears. But what made James's blood freeze was the face. It was identical to Sophia's. A growing murmur took over the church. The guests turned, shocked. Eleanor Blackwood brought her hand to her chest, as if feeling a sharp pain. Richard Blackwood closed his eyes, pinching the bridge of his nose firmly. And Nathan lowered his head as if already expecting this moment. The woman at the entrance advanced down the aisle, her vacillating legs seeming almost to give way with each step. "Stop!" she shouted, her voice heavy with desperation. "That's not me!" James looked at the woman beside him, then at the figure advancing down the aisle, and understanding hit him like lightning. Twins. Sophia had a twin sister. The bride beside him gripped his hand tightly, as if fearing James might run away. "I did this for us," she whispered, desperation transparent in every word. "I've always loved you, James." Chaos ensued. People murmured, exchanging confused glances between the two identical brides. The minister, visibly disturbed, took a step back. "What's going on here?" demanded James, freeing himself from the false bride's grip. The real Sophia reached the altar, tears streaming down her face. "I was going to come back. I just needed time. But they wouldn't let me decide." The weight of the lie fell upon James like thunder. He looked at the woman who had almost become his wife, who was willing to live a lie just to be by his side. Then to Sophia, the one he had chosen from the beginning but who had run away. A sepulchral silence took over the church. Even the whispers had ceased, as everyone awaited the next move in that unthinkable family drama. "Who are you?" James asked the false bride, his voice trembling with anger and confusion. "Olivia," she replied, her eyes welling up. "I'm Sophia's sister." "Twin sister," corrected Sophia, her voice heavy with sorrow. "Twin sister that our family hid from society for years." The guests' gazes turned to the twins' parents. Eleanor Blackwood's face was as pale as wax, while Richard Blackwood maintained his impassive expression as if watching a bad play. "Why? Did you never tell me about your sister?" James asked Sophia, feeling betrayed at a level he could barely comprehend. Sophia lowered her eyes. "Because I barely knew her myself," she confessed. "We were separated as children. Olivia was sent to be raised by our aunt in Boston. Our parents thought it would be inconvenient to have identical twins." A murmur of disbelief ran through the church. James felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. He never questioned the fact that Sophia never spoke about Olivia. How had he never noticed Nathan's strange looks whenever the subject of family came up? "But that doesn't explain," began James, turning to Olivia. "Why are you here, dressed as a bride? Why did you try to marry me pretending to be your sister?" The silence was broken by a sob from Sophia. Her gaze turned to her parents, who remained seated, rigid as statues. She took a deep breath and, in a thread of a voice, began to explain. "I've always loved you, James, but I began to realize I was getting married out of fear. Fear of disappointing my family, fear of admitting that maybe I wasn't ready." She ran her hands over her face. "And last night everything collapsed. My mother reminded me of how important this wedding was for our family's image, of how everyone expected me to be perfect. And then I realized I never had the right to choose. My entire life was decided by them." James felt his stomach turn. He had never suspected the pressure Sophia was under, but now it all made sense. "So I ran. Not because I don't love you, but because I needed to know if this love was mine or if it was something they taught me to want." The church remained silent for a long moment until Olivia stepped forward. "I knew she was going to run away," she confessed, her voice heavy with emotion. "And I knew they wouldn't let that happen. So when our parents said I had to take her place, I accepted." James looked at her with incredulity. "Why would you do that?" Olivia's eyes were watery. "Because I love you. I've always loved you." Through Sophia's stories, through photos, videos, calls where you appeared in the background, I built this perfect image of you. And if this was the only way to have a moment by your side, then I would accept living this lie, even if just for one day. The guests watched this surreal scene as if it were a spectacle. Some discreetly filmed with their phones, while others whispered, predicting the scandal that would dominate the social columns the next day. James felt as if he were in a nightmare from which he couldn't wake up. His entire carefully planned life was crumbling before his eyes. "How could you do this?" he asked, addressing Sophia and Olivia's parents. "How could you try to deceive me like this?" Eleanor Blackwood finally stood up, adjusting her silk jacket as if she were at a charity tea and not in the middle of a scandal. "James, dear, you need to understand. Sophia was just nervous, like any bride. She would get over it. But we couldn't cancel the wedding. The guests, the press, Richard's investors, what would they say? It was just a temporary solution until Sophia came to her senses." Her words, cold and calculating, provoked a wave of shock. The way Eleanor spoke, as if she were discussing a business strategy and not her daughter's future, James's happiness, was disturbing. "And you?" James turned to Richard Blackwood, who remained seated, observing everything with disconcerting calm. "You agreed to this?" Richard Blackwood adjusted his expensive glasses and looked directly at James. "Sophia has responsibilities to this family. Commitments. The Blackwood name opens doors, but it also brings obligations. She's known that since childhood." "Obligations?" Sophia stepped forward, her voice carrying an anger James had never seen before. "Is that how you see my life? As an obligation to maintain the family name, to secure contracts and alliances?" The tension between father and daughter was palpable. For the first time, James saw Sophia confront the family patriarch without hesitation. "You hid my sister for years," continued Sophia. "Separated us because two identical daughters didn't fit the perfect image you wanted to project. And now you were going to force me into a marriage, even knowing I had doubts." "It wasn't just any marriage, Sophia," replied Richard, his voice firm. "James comes from the Mitchell family. The union of our families would mean expanding our business to the West Coast, where the Mitchells have influence. This isn't about feelings, it's about responsibility. James felt as if he'd been punched. So that's it? Our relationship was always about business for you, Richard? A way to expand your empire? Richard looked at James with an expression that mixed pity and impatience. You're a good young man, James. You have potential. But be realistic. Do you think families like ours unite by chance? For love? That's for ordinary people. We have dynasties to build. The coldness of those words left everyone in shock. Even some guests, clearly from the Blackwoods' inner circle, seemed uncomfortable with the inhumanity of the situation. James looked at Sophia, then at Olivia, both victims of a toxic family system that treated them as pieces on a chessboard. He felt a mixture of compassion and anger growing inside him. James's mother, Mrs. Margaret Mitchell, who until then had observed everything in silence, stood up. With the elegant posture that characterized her, she advanced to the altar. "My son," she said, gently touching James's arm, "I think we need to leave. This ceremony is over." William Mitchell joined, his wife, his countenance grave. "Richard, Eleanor," he said, addressing the twins' parents, "we trusted our family to yours. We believed we were uniting not only our children, but our traditions, our values. Clearly we were mistaken." The dignity with which James's parents manifested themselves contrasted with the calculated coldness of the Blackwoods. It was as if two different worlds collided, one where family and feelings still mattered, and another where everything was reduced to transactions and appearances. Sophia stepped forward, taking James's hand. "Please forgive me, I really love you. I just needed time to be sure it was for me, not for them." Her eyes, red from crying, begged for understanding. James felt his heart tighten. 3 years of relationship, plans, dreams, promises, all stained by lies and manipulations. Then, to everyone's surprise, Olivia approached. Even with the identical wedding dress, even with a face identical to Sophia's, there was something deeply different about her. A vulnerability, a sincerity, that touched James. "I also ask for forgiveness," she said, her voice low. "What I did was wrong, I knew it was wrong. But when you grow up being treated as a secret, as a family shame, you do anything to feel like you belong somewhere. I just wanted for a moment to feel what Sophia felt all these years, to be loved, valued, seen." Olivia's painful confession brought a new silence to the church. It was no longer the silence of shock or tension, but a silence of understanding, of humanity amidst chaos. James looked at the two sisters, so alike in appearance, so different in experiences. Sophia, raised under the spotlight and constant pressure. Olivia, hidden in the shadows, deprived of her own identity. Both victims, in their own way, of a cruel family system. He took a step back, feeling the weight of that moment. "I cannot continue with this wedding," he declared, his voice firm despite the pain he felt. "Not like this. Not with so many lies." Sophia's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded, understanding. Olivia lowered her head, as if she had expected this response from the beginning. "But that doesn't mean I'm giving up on us," continued James, looking directly at Sophia. "It means we need to rebuild, on honest foundations, away from the influence of your families. If you really love me, as you say, then we'll have to find a path that's just ours." Sophia nodded, a flame of hope lighting up in her eyes. "It's all I want." James then turned to Olivia. "As for you, I can't pretend to fully understand what you did, but I can see that you too are a victim in this story." Olivia looked at him with surprise, as if she hadn't expected any kindness from him. "I hope that one day you find the courage to live your own life, not the shadow of your sister's," he concluded, with a sincerity that surprised even himself. With these words, James turned his back on the altar and walked toward the exit of the church, his parents right behind him. The murmur of the guests grew, but he no longer cared. The truth had finally come to light, and despite the pain, there was a strange sense of liberation. As he crossed the church doors, he heard rapid footsteps behind him. It was Nathan, Sophia, and Olivia's brother. "James, wait," he called, reaching him on the entrance steps. James stopped, turning to the young man he had always considered a friend, but who he now realized had been complicit in that farce. "I'm sorry," said Nathan, shame evident on his face. "I wanted to tell you, but you know my father. I tried to convince Sophia not to run away, tried to prevent them from using Olivia that way, but you weren't strong enough to do the right thing," completed James, disappointment clear in his voice. Nathan lowered his eyes. "Not all of us have the courage you showed in there." The words hung in the air between them. James nodded briefly and continued on his way, leaving behind the church, the wedding that never happened, and the family that tried to manipulate his life. The following months were a whirlwind. The scandal of the cancelled wedding circulated for weeks in New York high society, but James distanced himself from it all. He rented a small house in Cape Cod, on the Massachusetts coast, seeking the isolation and peace that only the sea could offer. There, between the blue of the ocean and the green of the landscape, he tried to rebuild his life piece by piece. In the mornings he walked along the deserted beach, letting the sound of the waves wash away his sorrows. In the afternoon, he worked remotely on projects for the architecture firm he had inherited from his grandfather. At night, he sat on the porch, observing the stars and wondering what the future held. It was on one of these nights that he heard knocks on the door. Upon opening it, he found Sophia, her face marked by a new determination. "How did you find me?" he asked, surprised. "Your father," she replied with a small smile. "He said you needed time, but that perhaps it was time to talk." James hesitated for a moment, but then stepped aside, inviting her in. The house was simple, very different from the mansions and luxury apartments to which Sophia was accustomed, but she didn't seem to mind. "You're different," observed James as he served 2 glasses of water. Sophia nodded. "A lot has changed. I left my parents' house. I'm living alone in an apartment downtown. Simple, but mine. I started working at an environmental protection NGO. It pays almost nothing, but," she shrugged, "I'm happy." The transformation was visible. The Sophia he had known had always been impeccable, always concerned with appearance, with what others would think. The woman before him wore simple jeans, hair tied in an unpretentious ponytail, and there was a new light in her eyes. They talked until dawn. Sophia told how she confronted her parents, how she refused to return to the path they had laid out for her. She spoke about the difficulty of cutting financial ties, of learning to live with less, but with more authenticity. She told how she was rebuilding her relationship with Olivia, years of forced separation, slowly being overcome by weekly video calls and visits when possible. "And what do you want now, Sophia?" asked James as the sun began to rise on the horizon. She looked directly into his eyes. "I want a chance to start over, to discover who we really are, without the pressure of our families, without external expectations. Just the 2 of us, James, getting to know each other for real for the first time." James felt his heart race. There was so much to rebuild, so much trust to recover. But looking at Sophia, at the real and imperfect woman she finally allowed herself to be, he knew it was worth trying. "One day at a time," he replied, extending his hand to touch hers. Sophia smiled, intertwining her fingers with his. One day at a time. 2 years passed. James and Sophia had slowly rebuilt their relationship with patience and honesty. They now lived together in Seattle, where James had opened a branch of his architecture firm, specializing in sustainable projects. Sophia coordinated marine conservation projects, combining her biology education with the passion for the environment she had always had, but was never encouraged to pursue. It was a Sunday afternoon when the doorbell rang. Upon opening the door, James found himself face to face with Olivia. He hadn't seen her in person since the day of the frustrated wedding, although he knew through Sophia that she was rebuilding her life in Portland, where she was studying psychology. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything," she said, visibly nervous. James smiled, inviting her in. "Sophia's at the beach. She should be back soon. She'll be happy to see you." Olivia nodded, looking around the simple but welcoming house that the couple shared. "You've built something beautiful here." "We're trying," replied James, offering her coffee. They sat on the porch, observing the sea in the distance. The silence, Between them was uncomfortable, laden with unresolved memories. "I came to say goodbye," Olivia finally said. "I got a scholarship to study in France. I leave next week." James looked at her with surprise. "That's wonderful, Olivia. Congratulations." She smiled, a genuine smile that made her look so different from Sophia, despite the physical resemblance. "Thank you. It's the first time I'm doing something completely for myself, you know. Not to please my parents, not to try to be like Sophia. Just for me." The sincerity in her voice touched James. He could see how much it had cost Olivia to break away from the role her family had imposed on her all her life. "Before I go," she continued, "I needed to tell you personally how sorry I am for what I did. Trying to take Sophia's place that day, it was wrong on so many levels. I was lost, confused, desperate for acceptance, but that doesn't justify what I did." James nodded, absorbing her words. "What you did was wrong, yes, but I better understand now why you did it, and I think we've all grown since then." Olivia looked at him with gratitude. "Sophia is lucky to have you. You're lucky to have each other." At that moment, Sophia arrived, her hair wet from the sea, her face illuminated by the sun. Seeing her sister, she froze for an instant, then opened a radiant smile and ran to hug her. James observed the two sisters embracing, so alike and so different. Two women who were finally discovering who they really were, free from the chains that had bound them for so long. Later, when Olivia had left and he and Sophia were alone again, James hugged her from behind, both contemplating the sunset. "What are you thinking about?" asked Sophia, nestling in his arms. James smiled, gently kissing her neck. "About how strange life is. That day in the church. It seemed like the end of everything, but maybe it was just the beginning of our true story." Sophia turned to face him, her eyes shining with love and certainty. "You know what I think? That sometimes we need to lose everything to find what really matters." James nodded, pulling her closer. He didn't need a full church or a wedding dress or the approval of powerful families. All he needed was there in his arms. Real, true, theirs. "I love you," he murmured against her lips. "I love you," she replied, with the certainty of someone who has finally found their own path. The sun set on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. One day was ending, but their story, the true story written by themselves, was just beginning. The end. Dear listeners, we hope that James and Sophia's story has touched your hearts. If you enjoyed this narrative of discovery and true love, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like the video. Every day we bring unique stories that explore the complexity of life and relationships. Don't miss our upcoming content and share your opinions about this story in the comments.